Hey, stop. We got a call. You don't look like you belong here. ID, now.
I live here. I'm washing my car.
Just cooperate and this is done. Don't make it harder. Officer Donovan.
I'm Sergeant Marcus Sterling, your supervisor. Badge number.
Sir,
What reasonable suspicion did you have besides my...
The silence that hung between us lasted exactly 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds, I watched Officer Kyle Donovan's entire world collapse. The man he had just ordered to cooperate, the person he had profiled as someone who didn't look like they belonged, was not just a civilian. I was a 16-year veteran of the police department. I was a decorated sergeant. And as of 3 weeks ago, I was Donovan's direct supervisor in the West District Patrol Unit. This wasn't going to be a routine call that Donovan could write up and forget about. This was going to be a career-ending encounter that would be studied in police academies for years to come. And Donovan's own body camera was recording every single word. Kyle Donovan had been with the police department for 4 years. He was 29 years old, married, and considered himself a good cop. He had grown up in a mostly white suburban area, about 30 miles from the city of Seattle, where we now worked. His father had been a police officer, and Donovan had always wanted to follow in his footsteps. He had gone through the police academy, graduated in the middle of his class, and been assigned to the West District. His record showed 14 commendations for good police work. He had made several solid arrests, helped with community events, and his supervisors had always rated him as competent. But there was something else in Donovan's file that hadn't been addressed. Over his 4 years, he had received 9 complaints from citizens alleging racial profiling or inappropriate conduct. All 9 complaints had come from Black or Latino residents. All 9 had been investigated and marked as unfounded or unsubstantiated. The complaints had been investigated by his previous supervisor, Lieutenant Gary Henderson, who was known for protecting his officers and dismissing most civilian complaints as people trying to get out of legitimate police work. Henderson had retired 6 months ago. The new supervisor for Donovan's unit was someone from another division, someone Donovan had never worked with before. That supervisor was me, Marcus Sterling. I am 39 years old and have been with the department for 16 years. I started as a patrol officer, worked my way up to detective in narcotics, and then moved into supervision. I have an exemplary record, 2 Medal of Valor commendations for actions under fire, dozens of successful investigations, and a reputation for being tough but fair. I had also spent the last 5 years living in the Oak Creek neighborhood, one of the nicer areas in the city. My house was a well-maintained 4-bedroom colonial-style home with a detached garage and a pristine front yard. The neighborhood was predominantly white, upper-middle class, and quiet. I had moved there with my wife and our 2 sons. I loved the neighborhood. Good schools, low, crime-friendly neighbors. I had introduced myself to everyone on the block when I moved in. Most of them were welcoming. A few seemed surprised that a Black family was moving into the area, but I had experienced that before. I focused on being a good neighbor and didn't worry about the rest. That Saturday morning in October, I had the day off. I decided to wash my car, a black SUV that needed a good cleaning after a week of rain. I pulled the car into the driveway, got out my bucket and sponge, and started washing. The weather was perfect temperature in the mid-60s, sunny with a light breeze coming off the water. I was wearing gym shorts, a faded navy t-shirt, and old sneakers. I had my earbuds in, listening to a podcast while I worked. I was completely relaxed, enjoying my day off, thinking about taking my sons to the football game later. I never heard the patrol car pull up behind me. Donovan had been cruising through the Oak Creek neighborhood on routine patrol when he got a call on his radio. Dispatch said, They had received a report of a suspicious person in the 4200 block of Elm Street. The caller, who remained anonymous, said there was a black male acting suspiciously around vehicles. Donovan responded that he would check it out. He drove to Elm Street and started looking for anyone who fit the description. That's when he saw me in the driveway washing a car. Donovan made several assumptions in rapid succession. First, he assumed I didn't live there. The neighborhood was too nice, too expensive. Second, he assumed I might be casing cars to break into. Third, he assumed this must be the suspicious person the caller had reported. Donovan never considered that I might actually live in the house. He never considered that washing a car in your own driveway on a Saturday morning is the opposite of suspicious. He never considered calling dispatch to get more details about the complaint. He just got out of his patrol car and approached with his hand resting on his service weapon. Before I continue, where are you watching from? Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you appreciate stories that expose the reality of racial profiling even within law enforcement, please hit that subscribe button right now. What happens next will shock you. I didn't notice Donovan approaching until the officer was about 10 feet away. I pulled out one earbud and turned around. That's when I saw a uniformed officer walking toward me with a serious expression and a hand on his service weapon. My first thought was that something had happened in the neighborhood. Maybe a break-in, maybe an accident. I turned off the hose and walked toward Donovan, expecting a professional interaction between two law enforcement officers, even though Donovan didn't know who I was yet. But Donovan's first words weren't professional. They were an accusation wrapped in a demand. He said they got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here and he needed to see some ID. I felt the statement land like a punch to the gut. Someone who didn't look like they belonged. Not someone doing something suspicious. Not someone matching a description of criminal activity. Just someone who didn't look like they belonged in this neighborhood. I kept my voice calm and stated the obvious. I lived here. I was literally washing my car in my own driveway. It was a simple statement of fact that should have ended the encounter immediately. But Donovan didn't apologize, didn't step back, didn't reconsider. He just told me to cooperate and we'd be done here. As if I was the one being difficult. As if simply existing as a black man in a white neighborhood required cooperation with police demands. I asked the question that hung in the air. You're really going to do this? It wasn't just a question about the ID demand. It was a question about whether Donovan was really going to engage in obvious racial profiling, whether he was really going to stop someone for no reason other than race. Donovan's response confirmed everything. He told me not to make this harder than it needed to be. The implication was clear. Submit. Don't question, don't assert your rights. Just comply with whatever a police officer demands, legal basis or not. That's when I made my decision. I identified myself, stated my name, my rank, and added that I was sure Donovan recognized the name, though from the look on Donovan's face, he clearly didn't. Then I asked for Donovan's badge number and informed him he was in big trouble. You could see it in the body camera footage later. Donovan's face went from confident authority to absolute shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His hand dropped from where it had been resting near his weapon. He took an involuntary step backward. I let the silence hang for a moment. Then I spoke, my voice calm, but with an edge of steel. I asked Donovan for his badge number again. Donovan, still in shock, stammered out, 5923. I then asked Donovan to explain in detail what reasonable suspicion he had to stop someone washing a car in their own driveway. What exactly about the call justified this stop? Donovan tried to recover. He said he got a call about someone who looked suspicious. I asked what the call said specifically. Donovan repeated that someone didn't look like they belonged. I pressed harder. What made them suspicious? What criminal activity was reported? Donovan had no answer that didn't involve racial profiling. He hadn't been told about any crime. He hadn't observed any suspicious behavior. He had simply been told someone didn't look like they belonged, and he had seen a black man washing a car. I asked if Donovan had verified the address of the complaint. He hadn't. I asked if Donovan had called for any additional information from dispatch. He hadn't. I asked if Donovan had observed any actual criminal behavior before approaching. He hadn't. I then asked the question that would become central to the investigation that followed. I asked Donovan if the only reason for the stop was the fact that I was a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, was that what didn't look like they belonged actually meant. Donovan tried to deny it. He said it wasn't about race. It was about responding to a call. Someone reported a suspicious person. I pressed. What was suspicious? The caller said someone didn't look like they belonged. Donovan couldn't explain how that translated to reasonable suspicion without admitting it was purely about race. Donovan tried to pivot. He said I should just cooperate and this would be over. My response was ice cold. I pointed out that just cooperate wasn't a legal standard for detaining someone. Officers need reasonable suspicion. Donovan still couldn't articulate any. The interaction lasted another 6 minutes. I methodically walked Donovan through every mistake he had made, every assumption, every policy violation, every constitutional issue. I explained that didn't look like they belonged is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. I explained that being black in a white neighborhood is not reasonable suspicion of a crime. I explained that anonymous calls without specific criminal activity do not justify stops without independent verification. Quick question for you watching. If you've ever been profiled by police, even though you were doing nothing wrong, type "it happens" in the comments. Let's show how common this really is. Donovan tried several tactics to minimize what he had done. He said he was just following up on a call, doing his job. I pointed out that doing your job means investigating properly, not making assumptions based on race. Donovan said the caller seemed concerned. I asked what specific concern was mentioned. Donovan couldn't provide one beyond someone not belonging. Donovan said I should understand cop to cop, that sometimes you have to make quick judgments. I said that quick judgments based on nothing but race are still racial profiling and still unconstitutional, cop or not. By the end of the interaction, Donovan knew he was in serious trouble. I told him to return to the station and report immediately to the watch commander. I said I would be filing a formal complaint and initiating an internal investigation. Donovan's body camera had captured everything, and I had also recorded the interaction on my personal phone. Donovan drove back to the station in a state of shock. He had just threatened to arrest his own sergeant. He had engaged in obvious racial profiling, and it was all documented. There was no way to explain this away. When Donovan arrived at the station, the watch commander was already waiting for him. Word had spread fast. I had called ahead. Donovan was immediately placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His badge and gun were taken. He was sent home with instructions not to discuss the case with anyone. The investigation began that same day. Internal Affairs assigned 2 senior investigators. They reviewed Donovan's body camera footage first. The video was damning. You could hear Donovan's exact words, "We got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here." You could hear me calmly explaining that I lived there and was washing my car in my own driveway. You could hear Donovan telling me to just cooperate without any legal justification. The audio captured my controlled anger when I asked, "You're really going to do this?" And it captured the moment everything changed when I identified myself as Sergeant Marcus Sterling and told Donovan he was in big trouble. They pulled Donovan's personnel file and found the 9 previous complaints. Now, they had context. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern that had been ignored. They interviewed me in detail. I provided a thorough statement. I explained that I had experienced profiling before as a civilian, but experiencing it from one of my own officers while off duty was particularly disturbing. I said it raised serious questions about Donovan's judgment and whether he had been engaging in racial profiling throughout his career. The investigators interviewed Donovan 3 days after the incident. Donovan tried to defend his actions. He said he was responding to a legitimate call. When investigators pointed out that the call gave no specific location and no description beyond black male, Donovan said he had to make a judgment call. Investigators asked why he assumed I was the person from the call when I was clearly washing a car in a residential driveway. Donovan said the caller reported someone who didn't look like they belonged. When pressed on what that actually meant, Donovan couldn't articulate anything that didn't come down to race. They asked Donovan what he meant when he told me to just cooperate. Donovan said he was trying to de-escalate. Investigators pointed out that demanding ID without legal justification isn't de-escalation. It's escalation. It's a violation of rights. They asked Donovan if he had known I was a sergeant when he approached. Donovan said no. They asked if that would have changed his approach. Donovan said, probably. That answer was revealing. It meant Donovan would have treated a white homeowner differently than he treated me. It meant his approach was based on assumptions about who belonged in the neighborhood, not on actual suspicious behavior. The investigators reviewed the original call to dispatch. The anonymous caller had simply said there was a black male on Elm Street who didn't look like he belonged and was acting suspicious around cars. The caller didn't give a specific address, didn't describe any criminal behavior, didn't provide any details beyond race, a vague location, and the loaded phrase, didn't look like he belonged, like he. It was, in other words, a perfect example of the kind of racially motivated call that officers are trained to investigate carefully rather than act on immediately. Anonymous calls using phrases like doesn't belong, combined with racial descriptions and no specific criminal activity, are often from people with bias who see any person of color in their neighborhood as inherently suspicious. Donovan should have called for more information, should have observed before approaching, should have looked for actual criminal behavior. Instead, he saw a black man and assumed he was the problem. The investigators also found something else troubling. They pulled dispatch records for Donovan's entire 4-year career and found a pattern. Donovan had responded to calls about suspicious persons at a rate 40% higher than other officers in his district, and 87% of those calls had involved people of color. Either Donovan was assigned to an area with legitimately more suspicious activity by people of color, or Donovan was actively seeking out calls that allowed him to stop people of color. The data suggested the latter. Do you think the department should have caught this pattern earlier? Let me know what you think in the comments. The investigation took 7 weeks. During that time, investigators conducted 23 interviews, reviewed 14 hours of body camera footage from Donovan's previous stops, and analyzed 4 years of dispatch records and incident reports. The findings were unequivocal. Donovan had violated department policy on racial profiling. He had conducted an investigatory stop without reasonable suspicion. He had failed to properly investigate before approaching a citizen. He had made assumptions based on race rather than behavior. But the investigation uncovered something much larger than a single incident. Investigators tracked down the 9 individuals who had filed previous complaints against Donovan. 8 of them agreed to be interviewed. Their stories were remarkably consistent. A 45-year-old black attorney named David Brooks described being stopped by Donovan while jogging in a park near his home. Donovan had demanded ID and asked what Brooks was doing in the area. Brooks explained he lived nearby and ran there 3 times a week. Donovan had made him wait while he ran Brooks's ID for warrants. There were none. Donovan let him go without explanation or apology. A 32-year-old Latina small business owner named Maria Sanchez recounted being stopped by Donovan while loading equipment into her van outside her own store. Donovan had accused her of stealing and demanded to see receipts for the equipment. Sanchez owned the store, and the equipment was hers. She showed Donovan her business license. Donovan claimed he was just being thorough. Sanchez filed a complaint. It was marked unfounded. A 19-year-old black college student named Kevin Jamal described being stopped by Donovan while walking home from class at 8 p.m. Donovan asked where he was going, where he had been, and why he was in that neighborhood. Jamal explained he was a student who lived 3 blocks away. Donovan made him empty his backpack on the sidewalk. Jamal filed a complaint. It was investigated by Lieutenant Henderson and dismissed as a lawful investigative stop. The pattern was undeniable. Donovan consistently stopped people of color in situations that didn't warrant stops. He consistently demanded identification without legal justification. He consistently assumed people of color were out of place in certain neighborhoods. More importantly, the investigation concluded that Donovan's 9 previous complaints should have been taken more seriously. A pattern review showed that all 9 complaints described similar behavior, Donovan assuming people of color didn't belong in certain neighborhoods, Donovan demanding ID without legal justification, Donovan being aggressive in situations that didn't warrant aggression. The investigation also revealed that Lieutenant Henderson had been deliberately vague in his investigations of Donovan's complaints. Henderson's reports used phrases like "officer was conducting legitimate police work" and "complainant misunderstood standard procedures" without actually examining whether the stops met constitutional standards. In 3 cases, Henderson hadn't even interviewed Donovan before closing the complaint as unfounded. He had simply reviewed Donovan's incident report and accepted it at face value. In 2 other cases, Henderson had interviewed Donovan but hadn't asked any challenging questions about why the stop was made or whether racial bias might have been a factor. The previous supervisor had failed to identify the pattern, or worse, had identified it and chose to ignore it. The investigators noted in their report that Henderson's failure to properly supervise Donovan had allowed a problematic officer to continue violating citizens' rights for years. The recommendation was termination. Donovan's union fought it, arguing that he had been responding to a legitimate call and that his actions, while perhaps overly aggressive, didn't rise to the level of termination. The department's response was simple. Donovan had profiled a sergeant based on race. If he would do that to a superior officer, what was he doing to regular citizens who didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back? The union's argument failed. Donovan was terminated 9 weeks after the incident. His appeal was denied. His law enforcement career was over at age 29. But the consequences went beyond just Donovan. The department launched a comprehensive review of how civilian complaints were handled. They found that under the previous supervisor, Lieutenant Henderson, complaint investigations had been cursory at best. The review examined 127 complaints that Henderson had investigated over his final 5 years as a supervisor. Of those, 94 alleged some form of discrimination or excessive force. Henderson had found merit in only 3. The rest were dismissed as unfounded, unsubstantiated, or complainant withdrew. But when Internal Affairs re-examined 30 of those complaints with access to body camera footage and dispatch records that Henderson hadn't reviewed, they found patterns of problematic behavior in 18 cases. Officers making stops without reasonable suspicion. Officers using force in situations that didn't warrant it. Officers making racially coded comments. Henderson's failure to investigate properly hadn't just protected Donovan. It had protected multiple officers whose conduct needed to be addressed. The department published a scathing report criticizing Henderson's supervision and noting that his failure to properly investigate complaints had allowed problematic behavior to continue unchecked throughout his division. Henderson had retired 6 months before my incident with Donovan, so he couldn't be disciplined. But the department stripped him of his retirement ceremony honors and made it clear that his legacy would be one of failed leadership. Several community leaders called for Henderson to return his pension, though legally that wasn't possible. The department also implemented sweeping new protocols based on what the investigation had revealed. All complaints alleging racial profiling would be investigated by Internal Affairs, not by division supervisors, eliminating the conflict of interest that had allowed Henderson to protect his officers. All stops would be reviewed quarterly for patterns of racial disparity. The department hired a data analyst whose sole job was to track stop data, looking for officers whose stops showed racial disparities that couldn't be explained by legitimate factors. All body camera footage from investigatory stops would be randomly audited to ensure officers were following proper procedures. 5% of all stops each month would be pulled at random and reviewed by a team of supervisors and community representatives. The department created a civilian review board with actual power. Previous civilian oversight had been advisory only. The new board could compel testimony, access all records, and make binding recommendations on discipline for sustained complaints. Officers were required to complete 16 hours of implicit bias training annually, not the previous 2-hour online module that officers could click through without paying attention. The new training was in-person interactive and included scenarios designed to make officers confront their own biases. The department also established an early warning system that would flag officers who showed patterns of problematic behavior before it rose to the level of sustained complaints. If an officer had 3 complaints alleging similar conduct within a year, even if none were sustained, they would be automatically flagged for additional supervision and training. I was involved in developing the new training program on implicit bias and racial profiling. I shared my own experience with the body camera footage as a training example. Officers watched a respected sergeant get profiled by one of their own. It was powerful and uncomfortable, which was exactly the point. The training didn't just show my incident. It showed the body camera footage from several of Donovan's previous stops. Officers watched Donovan stop the attorney while jogging. They watched him harass the business owner outside her own store. They watched him make a college student empty his backpack. Then, trainers asked the officers to identify what reasonable suspicion Donovan had in each case. The answer was always the same: none. The only common factor was the race of the person being stopped. I also became an advocate for officers of color within the department. I discovered that I wasn't the only black officer who had experienced discrimination. Several others shared stories of being stopped by fellow officers while off duty, being questioned about why they were in certain neighborhoods, being assumed to be suspects rather than officers. I started a mentoring program pairing experienced officers of color with newer recruits. I worked with command staff to address issues of discrimination and bias within the ranks. I pushed for more diversity in hiring and promotion. The incident had revealed that these problems existed even among those sworn to protect and serve, and I was determined to change that culture. Donovan's termination attracted media attention. Local news covered the story of an officer fired for profiling his own sergeant. The story went viral on social media. The body camera footage was released after the investigation concluded, and it was viewed millions of times. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own experiences of being profiled. Black professionals who had been stopped in their own neighborhoods. Latino business owners questioned in their own stores. Asian Americans followed by security in high-end shops. The story resonated because it showed that profiling happens to everyone, regardless of education, profession, or status. Even a decorated police sergeant wasn't immune to being treated as suspicious simply for being black in a white neighborhood. Donovan gave one interview after his termination. He said he felt he had been treated unfairly, that he had been responding to a call and doing his job. When asked if he understood why I had been offended, Donovan gave a halting answer that suggested he still didn't fully grasp the problem. He never apologized to me, not privately, not publicly. He moved out of state 6 months later and took a job in construction. His wife filed for divorce, citing the stress of the termination and her husband's inability to take responsibility for his actions. I continued to serve as a sergeant. 3 years after the incident, I was promoted to lieutenant. I'm now a respected voice in the department on issues of community relations and fair policing. The house on Elm Street is still my home. I still wash my car in the driveway on Saturday mornings, but now when patrol officers drive by, they wave. They know who I am. They know what happened. And they know that assumptions based on race have consequences. The incident became a case study in how racial profiling operates even within institutions that should know better. It showed that having policies against discrimination isn't enough if those policies aren't enforced. It showed that complaints need to be taken seriously and patterns need to be identified. Most importantly, it showed that racial profiling doesn't just hurt the people being profiled. It erodes trust in law enforcement, damages departments' reputations, and ends the careers of officers who let bias override their judgment. Marcus Sterling, washing his car that Saturday morning, was doing exactly what millions of people do every weekend. The only thing that made me suspicious was the color of my skin. And the officer who couldn't see past that lost everything. The lesson is simple, but profound. When you assume someone doesn't belong based on their race, when you approach them with suspicion, based on nothing but appearance, when you let bias dictate your actions instead of facts, you're not doing good police work. You're engaging in discrimination. And eventually, whether the person you're profiling is a sergeant, a lawyer, a teacher, or just a regular citizen trying to live their life, the truth comes out. The pattern becomes undeniable. The consequences become real. Donovan thought he was investigating a suspicious person. What he was actually doing was revealing his own biases. He thought his badge gave him the authority to demand ID from anyone who looked out of place to him. What he learned was that looking out of place based on race is not reasonable suspicion. The body camera footage from that October morning is still used in training sessions across the country, not just in police departments, but in discussions about implicit bias, racial profiling, and the importance of examining our own assumptions. Every time someone watches that video, they see the exact moment an officer's career ends. They see his face when he realizes the man he was profiling is his supervisor. They hear the excuses fall apart. They witness accountability in action. This story has been retold based on real events for educational purposes. The names of the individuals, Kyle Donovan, Marcus Sterling, Gary Henderson, and specific locations have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved and to prevent any unintended harm. The goal of this narrative is to educate the public on the constitutional standards of reasonable suspicion versus racial profiling. If this story opened your eyes to how racial profiling works, even within law enforcement, please share it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that expose injustice and hold people accountable. Drop a comment and tell me what you learned from this. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who need to see them. Thanks for watching until the end.